whoop. Can we get a whoop whoop for the last session of the day? All right, on a beautiful day in Gunnison. We're so excited to have the two of you here to present all the hard work that you've done. Congratulations. And thank you to all of you for coming and being here to support Bradley and Phoebe. I have the great honor of getting to guide this session. My name is Dr. Brooke Zanatel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Phoebe and Bradley. Their presentations are in regards to landscapes in transition, temporal vegetation monitoring. So, yeah, let's hear it. Let's give it to them. Whoop, whoop.
Thank you. So I'm just going to start out with a quick introduction on us. My name is Phoebe Roberts. I'm a second-year employee student, and I'll be presenting on my progress of my thesis today. Just some background information about me. I did my undergrad at University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon, and I moved to Colorado right after. I've kind of just been working for different agencies for the past 8 years with like BLM, CPW, and NPS.
And I'm Bradley Sowder. I got my undergrad at CSU in microbiology, and then went over to the USDA in a plant breeding laboratory where I really got interested in vegetation and how it's affecting landscapes and the remote sensing that's involved in the techniques that you can use to assess that stuff. And I'm also a second year's employee student. However, I'm flip-flopped, MEM going into the MSE, so I'll be presenting on my MEM project.
All right, so I'd like to start out with talking about climate change because it affects all biodiversity and ecosystems that we're working in right now. So if you don't know, climate change is a major driver of extinction and biodiversity loss. Greenhouse gas emissions, because from the Industrial Revolution, are causing warmer climates, extended drought, extreme weather, altered bioregimes, shifted habitat suitability, as well as shifts in phenological timing and decreased host pollinator interactions. Under our current politics, 1 in 6 species are at risk for extinction, with endemic taxa being the most vulnerable because of their narrow gene pools and isolated populations. Wetlands are also at a huge risk of drying out due to climate warming up. And in Colorado, wetlands make up only 2% of the landscape, yet encompass up to 14% of the native plant species. Temporal monitoring is observing changes in vegetation over time, and it's an important tool in monitoring climate change and the effects on biodiversity and ecosystems.
So what does that all mean? It's great that we have all of this data and all of these theories of what is happening within our ecosystems. But in real world application of what are we actually doing with all of this is a technique called adaptive management. Adaptive management is this iterative process of kind of getting all this data and all of these thoughts and being able to implement them and then reassessing what we're doing as land managers. So we have implemented processes and we go into this cyclical nature of, okay, now we plan behind it. What are we going to do? How is it going to affect these ecosystems in these biomes? And then after the implementation, then you go back on the back end and, okay, is it actually doing what we want it to do? Is it actually showing us any characteristics of trends that's happening in the landscapes and whatnot? And then from that process, you incorporate this data and reevaluate your management practices and really refine what we're doing to be able to dive into these really deeper contexts of water budgeting, carbon budgeting, and really assessing the viability of our ecosystems, which Phoebe talked a little bit about, where a strong indicator of a strong, viable, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem is the vast biota that is within there. So being able to get this data and quantitatively assess what we're actually seeing, and being able to make predictions off of that is really what we're trying to do here. In particular, both me and Phoebe's studies use different techniques to extrapolate data and processes that are happening within the environment. And yeah, I guess from there, I'll let Phoebe kick it off.
Okay, so my thesis is called Assessing Long-Term Vegetation Change in Gunnison Sage-Grouse Habitat. So Gunnison sage-grouse was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 2014. There are currently less than 5,000 individuals inhabiting just an area in southwest Colorado and on the eastern border of Utah. There's been little research looking at the historic vegetation composition, as well as changes in that, and specific forb and grass species that the bird may utilize. Additionally, there's not a great understanding of historic fire regimes and how these may have changed over time. The objectives of my thesis are to reconstruct vegetation, composition, and cover in Gunnison sage-grouse habitat, going back at least 3,000 years, using paleo-ecological techniques like phytoliths, charcoal, and stable carbon isotopes. The research questions that I plan to address are: how has vegetation, composition, and cover been altered in Gunnison sage-grouse habitat following European settlement? What changes to taxa are associated with decline of sage-grouse populations, so those specific forbs and grasses? And how have historical fire regimes been altered since European settlement? And what were okay. So we also want to know, how have historical fire regimes been altered, and what was the fire return interval prior to European settlement? So phytoliths are microscopic silica fossils that are found in and between the cell walls of plants. So when plants are taking up water from their roots, minerals like silica are incorporated, and they can go on to form structural elements of the cell. So when the plant decomposes, those silica fossils can remain stable in the soil for millions of years, and they can be diagnostic to about the tribe, family, or genus level, which can allow us to reconstruct vegetation, composition, and cover, as well as climatic conditions through ratios of cool and warm season plants. So soil charcoal is exactly what it sounds like. Basically, when there's a fire, charcoal accumulates in the soil, and it can help us quantify wildfire frequency, intensity, proximity, and also timing of events through radiocarbon dating pieces of soil charcoal. Stable carbon isotopes are the last thing that I'm using. But first, I'm going to give some quick background information on this. So there are 3 carbon isotopes. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are the stable ones. So carbon-12 has 6 neutrons in its nucleus. It's lighter, it forms weaker bonds that are easier to remove. And then carbon-12 has 7 neutrons in its nucleus, so it's heavier, and it forms stronger bonds that are harder to remove. Carbon-14 is the radioactive one that has 8 neutrons in its nucleus. We use this for constructing age models by radiocarbon dating. But for this purpose, we can just ignore it for now. So isotopic signatures are basically just the ratio of the heavy carbon isotope to the light one. So carbon-13 to carbon-12. And isotopic signatures can be unique to different processes due to different rates of fractionation. So isotopic fractionation is basically just the partitioning of the heavier to lighter carbon isotope through different phases or reactions. So like in photosynthesis, when plants are taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, they tend to favor that lighter carbon isotope, carbon-12, because it has weaker bonds and it's easier to take up, which then concentrates carbon-12 more in plants than say in the atmosphere. So then that gives carbon-12 a lower isotopic signature. Or sorry, that gives plants a lower isotopic signature than the atmosphere. So it gets more complicated. So there's two main photosynthetic pathways. There's C3, which is cool season, and this is common in plants that are adapted to cool and wet climates. And then there's C4, which is warm season, and this is common in plants that are adapted to warm and dry climates. So the isotopic fractionation between these two photosynthetic pathways is actually different enough that it gives cool season and warm season plants a unique isotopic signature. And because cool season plants are adapted to cool and wet climates, and warm season plants are adapted to warm and dry climates, we can use this as an indirect proxy for paleoclimatic conditions. And that's basically what this graph here is showing. So up here, we have isotopic signatures that are from soil organic matter that reflect a landscape dominant in C4 perennial plants. And then over here, we have isotopic signatures that show soil that's dominant of C3, so cool season perennial plants. Now, when it's like that, or the cool C pathway, it generally reflects to temperatures around this range, so pretty cool. And then precip around this range, so wet. And then over on this side, it's just the opposite of that. So warm and dry conditions. This y-axis here is basically just showing age of deposition. So this came from a sediment core from a lake. So this was basically the top of the core, and they used radiocarbon dating to figure out the age of everything along here. So modern day dates up here, and then older dates down here. And a way we can read this is, say we start like down at 12,000 BP in like the younger dryas period. We can see that the landscape was dominant of C3 plants, meaning it was cool and wet. And then as the climate warmed up, we eventually got to a landscape that's dominant by C4 grasses or C4 plants, meaning it got warm and dry. So this study was from a site in New Mexico. So this is kind of just showing how the climate warmed up and became what it is now. So my results will end up looking something like this. I took soil cores. So you can imagine that like this part right here is like my soil core. And this is the surface of it, which correlates to more modern soils. And then as you increase with depth, you increase with age. So on this one, at around like 160 centimeters, it's about 1,000 years BP. So this study here is looking at charcoal and phytoliths, which are these blue and green here, which is also what I would do, but plus isotopes on that too. And the way we read this is, for example, we look at all these little projections out here in charcoal. That's basically just telling us that there was a higher intensity fire during that time period on the landscape. And it's the same with Poaceae, which is grass phytoliths. Anytime there's like a bigger projection like that, it basically means there was more of that specific grass phytolith during that time period. And the way we can put this all together is, for example, if we look right here in the broadleaf trees phytoliths, we can see where it had its highest percent cover of those broadleaf tree phytoliths, coupled with not very much grass and not fire yet. And when we increase in time, we can see there's a fire right there, which corresponds to the landscape having almost no broadleaf trees at all, and then being dominated by grass phytoliths. So like I said, I took 4 soil cores, 2 by Gunnison and then 2 out by Grand Junction. I used a hand coring device like this, basically took them out, split them vertically, and then sliced them horizontally into 1 centimeter slices going down. And I've been extracting out the phytoliths, charcoal, and isotopes from there. This is a picture of some chemical processing for phytoliths. Basically just boil soil in acid until all you have left is silica bodies. And then it kind of looks like this. So all these funny shapes here are basically just phytoliths that we can use to diagnose our plant species. So soil charcoal processing is a lot more straightforward. Basically, we just take 1 cubic centimeter of soil and we sieve them out into 3 different size classes. So there's 250 micrometers, 150 micrometers, and then 53 micrometers. And then we put them on Petri dishes and count them. It looks like that. It's kind of like black and shiny. And these are some of my very preliminary results for charcoal. Like I said, we have the 3 different size classes. So 250 and 150 are our bigger pieces, and that's going to be more representative of fires that were local to our site. 53 is our smaller pieces, and that's going to be more representative of fires that were neighboring because they're small particles that basically blew in and were deposited. This is a total of all of them. And then this y-axis here is just depth. It will eventually be an age model once we get radiocarbon dates back. But basically, modern soils are up here, and then the older soils will be down here. And then on the bottom here, we basically just have count. And notice how there's a lot more of the 53 than there is of the bigger pieces. And that's just because there's more smaller pieces of soil. But basically, what this is telling us is we had 3 high-intensity fires there, and there, with some low-intensity fire in between at the local scale. And then on the regional scale, we had 3 more somewhat alternating with them. And putting it all together, it's basically just telling us that there is a lot of fire on the landscape and sagebrush ecosystems, and it likely played a really big role in shaping them, keeping the vegetation low, and keeping pinyon juniper out. So I still have a long way to go, but that was just a little taste at what's to come. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my advisor, Anna Carroll, everyone from the BLM who helped seek my grant, Ken Holsinger, Leah Waldner, Carol Dawson, Nate Seward, who's on my committee, Ian Breckheimer, who's on my committee, and then my 3 research assistants, Ashlyn, Jenna, and Riley. Thank you.
That was awesome. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So our little thing with the questions went to sleep, but here we go. Quick sec. Okay. How do you see the current federal political direction affecting how landscape research may be carried forward?
I'm honestly pretty nervous about that. I think so much of research relies on having federal land or just places where you can take samples at and not have to like pay anyone to get in. Also, federal land is generally, or can generally be more unaltered than public, so it serves a really great platform for surveying on.
Did you see the frequency of high intensity fires increasing over time at your sample sites?
I think it's a little too hard to tell right now because we don't have radiocarbon dates back. And once we actually build that age model and put it in place, it might change like the shape of our chart a little bit and maybe highlight that a little bit more. But I don't know, it's hard to say right now.
A little early.
Yeah, a little too early.
Well, it wasn't like you were trying to do much with what you were gathering in the data you have to analyze. So, yeah. Okay, so can you talk more about how you might use these findings in a management context?
Yeah, so actually for my MEM project, we're gonna write a white paper to update habitat guidelines for Gunnison sage-grouse. Basically what we're doing is we're trying to figure out what the pre-European settlement baseline for vegetation was, specifically with like percent cover of shrubs, grasses, in C3 and C4, then forbs and that sort of thing. And then try to apply that towards what our restoration goals should look like or what we should strive for the environment to look like. And then same thing for fire, say we find out like the fire return interval is 30 to 80 years, we'd want to recommend doing prescribed burns for low intensity fire during that time period. And
That's awesome. Okay. And then I guess this is a related question, but very direct. How do your findings affect the sage grouse?
I guess it kind of ties into the other one too. It's just trying to find out what the sweet spot is for, I guess, what good habitat looks like for sage grouse and how we can try to recreate that realistically with climate change and what we're going to expect in the future.
Awesome. Okay, two more questions. I'll blend them into one for you, okay? So what was the hardest part of your research and what piqued your interest to get into this?
Hardest part of the research is definitely just the time consuming part. Like some of the chemical processing or just the lab work in general, it takes like weeks to get a tiny little thing and then you have to figure out what it is on a microscope later. And I guess I got into this because I wanted to do more with habitat ecology. I have a background, especially in like plant ecology, and I did some wildlife, and I couldn't decide between them. But I also wanted to look at like climate change stuff. So paleoecology is kind of the sweet spot for that.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. What a wonderful project. You did a great job. And let's pass it over to Bradley.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think this is the last presentation of the day. So thanks for sticking around. I know it's beautiful outside, so after this, let's enjoy it. My MEM project was mapping vegetation in Colorado Rocky Mountains. And I did this in collaboration with Western Colorado University and Telluride Institute, specifically the Lab of Telluride Environmental Science and Engineering Laboratory, or TESSL. And I want to start out with talking about the Colorado River watershed. This is an imperative watershed for the southwest portion of the United States. It brings in about 40 million, it impacts about 40 million people and bringing them water for municipalities, drinking, whatever other uses that you can think of, including 4.5 million acres of agricultural land. And what's astounding about that is 85% of that water comes off of the western slope of Colorado. So understanding that region has direct implications on understanding what is happening with this watershed that affects so many people. And what we can see here is we're starting to get higher intensity and more prolonged drought periods. This graph in the bottom right here in the green shows wet years and red shows dry years, and it goes all the way back to the 1900s. And what's important to realize is these peaks, the higher they are, the more intensity we see it. And the clustering of them is the frequency in which it's happening. So as time progresses, we can see this general positive trend of more intense and a lot hotter and frequent dry periods and hot periods. Specifically, within the last 20, 30 years, we can see that really increasing here, where we're almost not getting any of these wet years and the intensity is increasing. And to bring that into context, within the last 5 years, the water availability within this western slope has been worse than it was in the Dust Bowl era. So another way to interpret this on a spatial pattern is that graph up there, and that shows kind of two different time periods in which this warming can be seen. 60s to like the late 80s, and then taking off from the late 80s to 2013. And that's showing that, yes, there was a little bit of intensity increase and prolonged higher temperatures, but within the last 40 years, that increase has occurred a lot more intensely. Specifically, the more red pixels shows a higher intensity of that. And what you might notice is this portion here, where we're seeing a lot more of this effect, is the same exact portion where the Colorado River watershed is flowing right through. And it has been shown that there's about a 3-degree increase in the Colorado River, which equates to about 5% water loss, just through processes like evaporation. And what has also been occurring within this area is higher population. So as the demand for water goes up, the actual water that's available is going down. And from there, I want to transition into talking about fens. Fens are a peak-forming groundwater fed wetland. And I guess it's more characteristic of areas like marshes and bogs, but it's a little bit more different. It's a lot more reactive to seasonal water patterns and what occurs. And what happens is, as rainfall happens or snowmelt occurs, then we get this peat formulation. It goes through that substrate and sits into these kind of pocket or lowlands, and sphagnum moss builds within these aquatic conditions. And because they're saturated 24/7, the rate of decomposition is practically zero. For the fens that we've been studying, it's been carbon dated back 20,000 plus years. So it's really this essential ecosystem of not only like carbon sequestration, but it forms this mat and substrate for other biological species to come in and promote biodiversity and retain some of this water of that ecosystem. And in particular, why I'm so interested in looking at these fens and studying these fens is because there's ecosystem indicators to what is happening within water availability. As they dry out interannually and throughout time, you can imagine that as the water recedes, that decomposition process starts reoccurring, thus changing the landscape features. And from there, you can kind of guess that the landscape itself will change, particularly vegetation in this context. So how do you get that and know all these things and understand like the processes going on and being able to actually apply that and make informed decisions off of that? Well, we're so lucky that we live in the generation of data and technology. So we can use remote sensing techniques to be able to provide actual quantitative and analysis of what is occurring over time and really be able to actually derive some of these trends that might be happening. What I am specifically interested in is this process of spectral imaging. So as a photon hits a certain object, it will reflect off and provide a certain reflectance value of whatever that wavelength was. And as you stack those wavelengths together, they create this unique spectral signature in which you can shove through a deep learning remote machine learning algorithm and be able to actually classify vegetation based off of their unique spectral characteristics that are coming out. And that's really unprecedented because now we're able to make quantitative assessments of landscapes at a large scale and be able to scale that up and make more informed decisions on what's happening over a broader region. You could get stuff like canopy coverage, model the environment, or even look at water availability and stuff that's occurring there based off of all these different spectral signatures. And essentially, that informs us of these wonderful, complex ecosystems in which we have very little understanding of what actually is going on. So, yeah, it kind of uncovers a little bit of layers there. My study site in particular was in Telluride, Colorado, and awesome enough, it was on the ski resort itself. So very beautiful area. If you haven't been there, I would check it out. And we're up here in the Prospect Basin and looking particularly at buckbeam and string fen. There's other fens that were there, but I didn't do the classification analysis on that. But we did fly them and we were able to take those spectral signatures for later processing. And these are the goals of this study. First one is to inventory vegetation compositions on the ground. This is like taking cover classes and actual species compositions of the area. And then after that, we obtained canopy level spectral data, which gets ushered into that machine learning algorithm, which classifies these different vegetation compositions. And ultimately, that leads to a long-term monitoring plan. So to address that first one, we are really interested in how the vegetation variability occurs on a radially aspect of these fens, because as the centralmost portion of these fens are usually more waterlogged, have that higher rate of non-decomposition and higher peat formation. As you extend outward of these fens, it gets drier, therefore the vegetation composition changes. So in each cardinal direction, we establish 5 plots, one being the most central plot, all the way to the perimeter plots being 5, and took species coverage and coverage composition values. After that, we got our Mavic 3 drone system with a multispectral sensor on it. And we're able to fly these areas to obtain that spectral data. And then that gets transformed into a pre-processing software. We use Agisoft Metashape Pro, and that creates these, what we call orthomosaics, or preliminary models of the system. And this is what that data looks like. It's this hypercube that each individual layer has its own spectral characteristic value. And I guess a way to conceptualize this is imagine taking a photograph of a landscape, but instead of having all RGB and what we can see, it's only one wavelength. It's just green. And then that next layer is just yellow, but throughout many different wavelengths. And that's really how we extrapolate that unique spectral characteristic that we shove into either ArcGIS or R. and are able to use that machine learning algorithm to classify our vegetation. And that's what we got. This is on the left, buck bean, and on the right, string fen. And as I alluded to before, that on the ground field research of actually obtaining the vegetation compositions, we get our model and relate that back to it to make sure to assess the accuracy that it's actually predicting correct values. For string fen, we got around 76% accuracy. And for buck bean, we got 90. And the thing to really take away from this is that radial pattern of vegetation variability, where centralmost plots are showing this dominated wetland sedge characteristic, along with other unique species like cotton grass or buckbean. As you slowly, progressively move out of these fens, you can see that the shift in vegetation is changing to more of a dryland native grass. And what we are expecting to see from this is that as climate change begins to progress and factors influence that, is the encroachment of these native grasses inwards. And that leads me to the long-term monitoring plan. This data set that I just showed you is the first year of a multi-year management plan in which you can make spatial analysis of vegetation coverage throughout time. And you can derive trends of, are these native grasses actually encroaching into the system? What does that mean? How does that impact the water availability of these sensitive ecosystems that are the headwaters of the Colorado River? And it's really cool because you could get interannual variations. Is this a wet year? Is this a dry year? How is it influencing the fen on an interannual basis? And then you can get this overall trend of, are we losing water over time or are we really not? And it's quantitative. So there's, all models are wrong, but it's our best guess on what is actually occurring in here. And there's little other influences, like political influences, being able to take away from this. So you can actually have hard data showing what is happening. And to make a full circle moment here, it gets pushed back into that adaptive management. And we are the evaluation and monitoring aspects of that adaptive management. So when we do this research and we provide this information, it's not just for knowledge's sake sometimes. It is to actually influence adaptive management practices that can help create a more viable, sustainable ecosystem for everybody. Because water that we drink and air that we breathe does not come out blue or red, and we are all biological beings being influenced by these processes. And with that, I'll leave it up to questions.
Oh, we got to log in again. Just a quick sec. Okay, here we go. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, it looks like you have some good ones. Are there cases for the use of this multispectral imaging within the agricultural sector? And can farmers use this technology to refine their irrigation systems?
Precisely. That's kind of how I got into spectral imaging. First was disease mapping, because I worked with sugar beets, and one of the main loss of that agricultural product is disease. And if you can program your tractor to understand where to actually harvest and where not to negate that secondary infection of the crop, then your productivity goes up. But in this case, like this person said, being able to, I think it's called precision agriculture. And that is this fun cross between the old ways of irrigation and the new ways of irrigation, where you can actually establish high points, low points, where water is holding, where you need to apply less water, and evapotranspiration rates. And all that can be implemented into these smart linear sprinklers now, which can really optimize that water that you're actually applying to the agricultural land.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Why do you think this type of monitoring is so novel when we've had drone imaging capabilities for some time?
I would
Or
say,
what's novel about it?
yeah, I think the novel side about it, because we've been able to do a lot of this imaging for a very long time. It's been expensive, super expensive. Technology is only increasing, and the cost and accessibility to that is decreasing with that. So with drones kind of coming into the market relatively recently, we could get a lot more fine resolution detail. Because up to this point, a lot of the stuff we've been using is through satellite imagery, which uses the same basic processes, but instead of a 3 centimeter resolution, you're going to a 5 kilometer resolution. So it's harder to dictate what these models are actually saying about the landscape. So being able to make that more accessible to researchers through cost and availability, and then also having higher computing systems to process these large amounts of data, establishes these new standards. So it is kind of a logarithmic, as things progress, newer, better, more refined ways are extrapolated from that.
Great. Here's a question. How do the activities of the ski resort affect the health of the fens?
So I didn't do a lot of the anthropogenic effects occurring with these fens. That's actually one of the main causes or motivation behind this, is to be able to tell, is this climate change or is it anthropogenic effects happening? And all of this is data that can be used from the long-term monitoring plan. Just because we established this base set data and monitoring plan in the context of climate change, it's all data, and you can apply it in any aspect that you need it to, that you're interested in. And I know that that's something that they are interested in, but yeah, I didn't have any part about the anthropogenic effects.
Cool. So that another question is related to, so what was the relationship? Did they know about your project? Did they want that data? Were they curious what it meant? Like, what was the data sharing or project design relationship, or how did that go?
So I think the infancy of it, Dr. David Cooper at CSU has been doing research in these fens for decades. And I got on a call with him and my community sponsor over at Telluride Institute. And we were just talking about, he's like, every year I go out there, I swear these native grasses that are along the perimeter are slowly encroaching. And like, he thought a foot a year, which is pretty substantial. And he's on the back end of his career. I think he retired a couple of years ago, had his last doctoral student. And that's kind of where I stepped in. I'm like, well, we have this drone platform that we were able to fund and get around. Let's actually create this baseline data to be able to start analyzing this, because the only thing they had before was old school photogrammetry of just looking at photos and seeing shifts in that way. So yeah, ushering them into a new era of monitoring.
Cool. All right. And so then one more question for you, and then we'll open it up for both of you guys. Great job. Is so here we are living in the headwaters in the Gunnison Basin. And I was a little disappointed not to see us on your Colorado River map, because we're the second largest tributary. But Should we be worried? I mean, we are at the headwaters, so aren't we protected from this warming climate and the drying out of these systems? Won't our water always be plentiful up here in the headwaters? Is it only the people downstream that need to worry?
It's almost quite the opposite. The water up here is a lot more affected by the climate than down there. It's down there, most of this water is kept in reservoirs. It's all downstream and it's held and then it's allocated out. Where up here in these shallower ecosystems and where the headwaters are and where the snow variability actually is impactful, we can see a drop in what we're actually getting, but that doesn't negate any of the policy that says we get this amount of water for the downstream portion of this river. And not to go too far into it, but the Colorado River is very contentious right now with the policy around it. It's, I think, adopted from a 1920s policy act where the weights between the upper Colorado River watershed and the lower Colorado River shed aren't really equaled out. And there's renegotiations happening, bringing native peoples to the table because they were the first people to actually use this water and they were left out in that old adoption of the policy. So there's a lot happening, but yeah, little headway being made, I would say.
Well, thank you so much, Bradley. That was wonderful. Let's give another round of applause to Bradley. And now we have a chance to open it up for questions to both Phoebe and Bradley. So I'll start. Now that you're at this point in your employees progress and you have your first degree under your belt, for those students that are just finishing their first year and they're starting to develop their projects and they're getting a little nervous, what advice do you have for them? What are some lessons learned that you wish maybe somebody had told you back when you were at their point?
I think I would say just be open-minded and flexible because you might have this idea in the beginning and then it'll change like 4 different times and just have to go with the punches and that's what it is. But yeah, just being open-minded and flexible.
Yeah, I think I'll echo that too. Just be flexible, adaptable, patience, and really whatever you get out of this is directly correlated to whatever you put into it. So
Great. Those are great suggestions. All right. Are you guys all in giving me some questions to ask them? Because I don't see too many. Oh, here we go. What's your biggest hope for your final results when you have them? What kind of impact would you like to make? Or I guess yeah, I'll just leave it wide open. What hope do you have for your final results? What's on your mind?
yeah, so for my project, it is complete. That is the final results, but I'm still working with them. And we're scaling up this monitoring to be able to encompass the whole San Juan mountain range. And it's a little bit more multifaceted than being able to, one, identify fens through remote sensing, and then 2, being able to do this research from that. So I would really like to see a good management practice behind that. And then, 5-10 years from now, kind of look at the changes that we're seeing. And yeah, that could be optimistic or pessimistic in either way that you see that.
I think for mine, it kind of sounds doom and gloom, but I want to capture like more of the biodiversity loss happening in sagebrush ecosystems. So there has been a lot of like remote sensing data that is showing that we're decreasing grass coverage and like sagebrush cover, but it only really goes back to like the 50s or so. So before even the Industrial Revolution and a lot of land changes happen. So really the degree of change is probably a lot worse and it's just not quantified that well yet. So just bringing that more
Cool, great. Um, thank you. So both of your research projects had a whole heck of a lot of data. So how do you use that data to tell a really impactful narrative and story that moves people emotionally?
I guess for mine, I think a lot of it is really like technical, nitty gritty. So really just putting it into like common language. So this is kind of what I'm going to be doing for my MEM project is I'm basically just writing a white paper for the BLM. So it's basically all of my findings, but in way simpler terms that average person could understand and not just a paleoecologist.
Yeah, I guess for me, you're a nerd and you love looking at data and kind of processing it and seeing what happens is the data tells the story itself. I guess I'm just the surrogate to translate that into a digestible format.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you ran into?
So when I was doing field research, I was finishing up my plots at Buckbean and I just felt exhausted and wiped out. I ended up getting COVID, finishing out the day, and then I spent 3 days in a tent just trying to survive. And that was the hardest part for me. Either that or trying to fund getting the Mavic 3 system. But yeah, COVID was rough.
I think for me, it's just ongoing setbacks forever. I feel like every time I go in the lab, something goes wrong and we just have to roll with it. Um, yeah. And it's just time consuming.
Um, if we had a local politician in the room, what is the one sentence that you would like to tell them as a take-home message, as a takeaway about both of your research?
Oh, it's hard. Um, I guess just illustrating the importance of climate change and what we need to do to take action to try to combat this so we can preserve our ecosystems and everything that we rely on.
Yeah, I would say that everybody in this room, everyone who's kind of interested in all of this has this innate feeling of and realization that we're just a biological creature in this overall system. And politics are man-made and form from that. What we're extrapolating here is reality, and it's not man-made. It's man influences it, but it's real, and that transcends any political influence that you might have, and you know, treat that with reality and respect, and make informed decisions.
Thank you. That was super inspiring. So we're going to close with one more question, kind of a combo of a couple here. And maybe you can just figure out how you want to approach it. How did your passions that you brought to Western prior to this project, how did they translate into what you're doing, what you've been doing? And also, while you were out in these places, what was a really amazing and memorable moment that happened to you in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been passionate about the environment ever since I could remember. I was going backpacking, and loving it, and then I was born in Colorado, Loveland, Colorado, so I've been here my whole life, and I've kind of witnessed this progression of population increase and kind of the effects around that. And something that was so instrumental in my life, I wanted to be able to facilitate and steward for other people where, you know, I do want to have this around for everybody because you can get so much out of it. And then, yeah, just being a nerd about data, I guess. And this is going to sound lame because it's going to get away from ecology, but when I was in Telluride, they had the Telluride Film Festival, and I had a drink at a speakeasy where Bill Murray was, and then Will Ferrell walked by. So it was very surreal watching all these tidy people while I'm just covered in mud. So
I guess I was expecting you to tell a bear story, but instead it was like a celebrity story.
Yeah, I guess I got into this kind of a similar way. I grew up like going on a lot of hikes and just being outside a lot. I've lived in like Utah and Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, Arizona. So a lot of very pretty states. And I've always been trying to do outdoorsy things. I talked about this a bit, but I've spent a lot of years doing field work and just love being outside and seeing different parts of the country that most people can't see. So trying to turn this into a career is kind of my motivation. And yeah, like Bradley said, protecting these ecosystems for everyone. I guess like a funny thing that happened when we were extracting our cores is like you have to basically pound it in the ground with like a sledgehammer or like a slide hammer type thing. And then you have to figure out how to get it out. But one of our cores got stuck on a root and it took us like 2 hours to get out. So we basically had to dig all around the entire thing to just get it. Struggles of research, I guess.
Yeah, I'm feeling like there's been a theme with some of the answer to the questions of perseverance. Yeah, perseverance, keeping the faith. Yeah. Well, let's give Bradley and Phoebe a great round of applause for amazing research, perseverance, and amazing contributions to the field. Thank you so much for all your work.